So, welcome to the second part of this lecture. In this part, we're going to talk about the physiology of the lungs, about the respiratory system, and we're also going to talk about a couple of hormones. We're also going to include a couple of case studies, so a set of diseases that are interesting to discuss in relation to the material that I'm going to be teaching you. First of all, there's some physiological anatomy. So over here you see the lungs, and the lung is also in respect to the ribs. And what's interesting to know is that at the front side, and this patient or this person who volunteered to do this, I suppose, is currently he has fully expired, I think. So there's the only air in his lungs right now is the residual volume. And what you can see is that the ribs cover more than that. So the liver is even covered by the ribs and parts of the intestines. Over here at the back, you can't see them, but there are the kidneys. And they are still protected by the ribs. So what we mean by thorax and abdomen is that thorax is everything above the diaphragm, which is a muscle that should lie directly under the lungs. We will talk about the muscles needed in respiration later. And everything above the diaphragm is called the thorax, and everything below is called the abdomen. So the liver is part of the abdomen, the lungs are part of the thorax. And what's important to know is that over here we have the trachea, and the trachea has something called a bifurcation, which is a point where it splits into the two main bronchi, and that's over here. So like about over here, and over here you can see like the entire the sternum, and the anatomy. Like the sternum is very important in recognizing and remembering where certain structures are, because if you look at rib 2, you see it's at the same height as this. It's a line here, but it's more of a notch, so more of a there's a joint actually between these two things. So and if you feel at yourself, it's kind of a part that bumps up. So it's below your like between your clavicles, and below that there you have a notch, and that's exactly attached to your second rib. So if you ever have to feel for a certain rib, you can feel that one, you can go to the left or right, and that's the second rib, and then you can count onwards. And you usually can't count all of your ribs, but that is how doctors and particularly cardiologists have to differentiate between different ribs so that they can auscultate your heart correctly. Because you can't auscultate over bone, you always auscultate over the intercostal spaces, so the spaces between the costa or the ribs. Now, this is some relevant anatomy. We're now going to dive into the physiology, or kind of the physics behind respiration in the lungs. What I first have to tell you, which is, and it's a basic principle, but not everyone gets it, which is that gases, or dissolved gas molecules in this case, always move from high concentrations to low concentrations because they want to form an equilibrium. And equilibrium means a set, like a boo science people say, all right? It's a time, or it's a moment at which the concentration is exactly equal at all different spaces. I will put the word here. Let's see, equilibrium. That's how you spell it. So you were close. And it's important to know this because when we're going to talk about exchange of gases, often people ask me, but how do you make sure that oxygen is diffused into your organs, and how do you make sure carbon dioxide is diffused out of organs? And it's exactly for this reason. And your body has a system for maintaining this in certain situations, so that you can take carbon dioxide out and put oxygen inside of your cells. Now over here, what you see is that there's something called a partial pressure I have to explain. So the normal atmosphere has a pressure of, let me draw this actually, pen. The normal atmosphere has a pressure of 760, that's 0, millimeters mercury. I will add these nodes to the presentation so you guys don't forget it. 760 millimeters mercury. And what we mean by that is that there's that 1 millimeter mercury is the amount of pressure needed to push like a full tube of mercury 1 millimeter upwards. So this fluid, push it up 1 millimeter upwards, that's 1 millimeter mercury. So we have 760 of these. And that's normal atmospheric pressure, so at sea level. And at sea level, you can imagine that you're either looking at countries like the Netherlands, because this is the main value we're taking, but you can also look like the United Kingdom and the coastal part of the United States. So let's see. For let's make this a proper 0, by the way. How many, like, what fraction of the atmospheric air consists of oxygen? That's a question to you guys. Sarah says 1/3. Okay. Technically, it's on my screen, so if you look like a bit exactly, then like what percentage of the atmospheric air consists of oxygen? And this is true for wherever you are, whether you're high in a mountain or whether you're at sea level. Not below water, of course, but yeah, it's about 20%, 20 to 21%. So you can see it over here. Atmospheric air is about 21%, 20.84 to be very exact. And the thing about partial pressure is that this is atmospheric pressure or total pressure, but the partial pressure, so the pp, is always the same as fraction times 760 in this case. So the atmospheric pressure. So if the atmosphere contains about 21% oxygen, it means that 21% of this is pressure that oxygen is delivering. So the partial pressure of oxygen is about it's about 160 millimeters mercury. My computer is touchscreen. Let me do it like this. Okay, my computer obviously says no to that one, but 160. So okay, that's supposed to be an approximately sign. So an approximately sign. So what I'm saying is that if oxygen is about 20% of the total content, it means that 20% of the atmospheric pressure is caused by oxygen. Yeah, it's the two squigglies. So it's about equal to 160. Yeah. So about 106. So the pressure that all of the oxygen in the air is delivering to this atmospheric pressure is 160. So it's perhaps difficult to grasp it, but this is just the definition of what a partial pressure is. And as you can see, is that when you inhale oxygen, when you first inhale it, which is over here, well, it says about 150 because when you get the air inside of your respiratory tract, the pressure is still 760, but your respiratory system will moisturize it. It will moisturize the air. It will add water. Normally speaking, there's about 0.5% of water in the air. Now there's about 6.20%. And that's always true. Magnolia asked, what's the 764? That's the atmospheric pressure. So add ATM, atmospheric pressure. So this is inhaled and humidified air. So there's water added to this. And then the air passes on through the respiratory tract and then it comes into the, let's see, the alveolar spaces and the dead space. Perhaps you guys, let's see, perhaps you guys know about the dead space. Do you guys know what the dead space is? Clone says he learned it. Can you, like, do you have any idea what it is? Well, at least what we mean by dead space. NS is empty space. So it's not empty because there's still air. But the reason why we call it dead is because there's no exchange of oxygen. When you look at the alveolar dead space, that is the same as your trachea. So if we go back to here, this over here forms dead space, as well as the bronchi, where there's no exchange of oxygen. Yeah, dead space is when there are all places in your respiratory tract where there's no gas exchange. And so that causes, and what happens is that in this dead space, there's also some carbon dioxide that you breathed out. So normally carbon dioxide is only 0.04% of the atmosphere, right? It's very, very little. But as soon as you, of course, go deeper into your respiratory tract, it will start to increase. And by the end, it will be around, as you can see, around 40. That's the pressure of CO2, as you can see, carbon dioxide. Whereas oxygen will decrease to about 100 in the alveoli. As you can see over here, it's about 100. And then you have this in equilibrium. So this is alveolar air. What they mean by that is the air that's in the alveoli themselves. So if you go to the lungs, if you'd have to zoom this out over here, you get this circle where we're now going to zoom out. And over here, what you see is that there are these small sacs. And in these sacs, you find air, like air with oxygen and carbon dioxide particles. That's the alveoli. What is that, people ask? A very bad drawing of the alveoli. It's not a smiley face. All right. So, and when you expire air, if you look at this, you can see that there is, as you can see, there's more oxygen in expired air than alveolar air. That's weird, right? So the air that you breathed in has less oxygen than the air that you breathed out. People ask, what's the humidified air? Atmospheric air is when it's outside of your mouth, but as soon as it goes into your respiratory tract, you have that your respiratory tract will humidify the air. So this is air that's inside of your trachea over here, like at the top here. And then over here at the trachea, you have alveolar. You're going to have like the mixed air. And then you have the air in the alveoli, which is over here. And expired air is when you breathe it out. There's more, well, yeah, there's percentage-wise, there's more oxygen in expired air compared to inhaled air. And that's kind of weird, right? Why is that? The reason for that is because it mixes with the air that's over here. So it, like, if you look over here, the middle or the average of this is about 120. That's why. Wait, we're plants. Well, we're not producing it, right? It's just that the fraction has gone up. Nothing has changed. This is mostly caused by oxygen that's derived from the atmosphere. Expired air is air that you breathe out. All right, so then we have the question of what causes actual breathing, because we know that it's muscle contraction that contracts our muscles, but what are we contracting against? Because there's a reason why you're contracting these muscles, of course. So here we go to something called transpulmonary pressure. Transpulmonary doesn't mean the pulmonary, like, that doesn't mean your lungs are changing genders, but it's the pressure when you compare the alveolar and the pleural pressure. So what we mean by alveolar is the pressure in the alveoli, so in the small sacs of the lung. because the lung consists of all kinds of small alveoli. And the pleural pressure, that's the pressure that is delivered by the pleura. And the pleura is a space that you can't really see here. Let me see if there's a... So if you see this sac, this blue thing, that's supposed to show a lung in full inspiration. But there's a little sac, a little layer around the lungs. That's called the pleural sac. Oh, yeah. And this pressure is delivered by the pleural space. It is very negative. And what we mean by negative is negative compared to atmospheric, because this 0, this is the atmosphere. And the pleural pressure is way below that. And as I told you guys earlier, pressure goes from high to low. Same as here. So so during inspiration, you make this pressure more negative. And so this one in total goes below 0, which means oxygen will flow in. And over here, it's going to go above 0, so oxygen will flow out. And as you can see over here in this graph, you see lung volume, which goes up in inspiration and down in expiration. So with an inspiration, your thorax expands, so your chest expands. And let's see. What then happens is that, let me check. So yeah, pressure goes down again, influx of air, and during the expiration, the thorax contracts again. I couldn't find a better word. Now you might notice that over here, we don't use millimeter mercury, but centimeter water. Why do we do that? I have no clue. Because physiologists do that a lot. My own centimeter water. Sorry, Sarah. Centimeters of water. My professors do this. And personally, to me, it makes no sense, but it does make the numbers a bit more easy sometimes. But where's my mouse? Oh, there. Okay. But you have to remember that you can convert it in this way. I'm not expecting you guys to be able to convert it, because the most important units of pressure, at least, are millimeters mercury and kilopascals, which they use most often in hospitals. And it turns out, at least I have to believe my professors for this, but like the university hospital where I study and work at uses kilopascals, whereas everyone else in the Netherlands uses millimeter mercury. So I think it's just my university that wants to be annoying. All right, or bars. So bar. 1 bar is the same as 760 millimeters mercury. But let's go on. So the muscles of respiration. So I'm thinking that I might have had to do this one a bit earlier, because now it kind of starts to make sense, right? When so this is expiration. So let's start with inspiration. When we're breathing in, what you can see is that the diaphragm has moved downwards. It has moved this way. That's nice. Let's see. What's 0 again? 0 is like the atmosphere. So this pressure is relative to the atmosphere. And as you can see, you only need very small differences in pressure in order to get enough oxygen flowing in. Because you don't need it at this instant, but you can do it over a while. So during inspiration, you use something called your external intercostal muscles. These are contracted, which are these ones over here. And what they do is that they cause your rib cage to go a bit forward and a bit upward. So this, and you have the diaphragm that's also moving downwards. And during expiration, what you use are your internal intercostals over here, and they kind of pull it backwards. Your diaphragm again, which is also going to go this way. And in deep expiration, you also use the abdominal muscles that also cause this way. Which is, for example, when you breathe in and you forcefully do it, you can feel your abdominal muscles contract. And now there's a difference between resting respiration and forced respiration. So in resting state, when you inspire, you only use your diaphragm. When you expire, you don't do anything. You just release your diaphragm. So there's not a single muscle you're contracting. Rather, with forced inspiration, which is inspiration when you're forcing yourself or during exercise, you can contract your external intercostals, which are the most important muscles, and with expiration, you contract the internal intercostals over here, and sometimes the abdominals. And there's a set of different muscles that are not relevant. They're minor muscles that can help, but these are the major muscles that help you breathe. And now we're going to go to a case study. So, oh, whoops. I was supposed to animate this, but never mind. So myasthenia gravis. It's on the right here, so you can spell it correctly. Myasthenia gravis. And myasthenia gravis is a type of disease. It's an autoimmune disease where you have like a breakdown or an immune response to something called your neuromuscular junction. I think we talked about muscle contraction earlier, like that was in the last lecture where we talked about the nervous system. And what happens here is that the neuromuscular junction is a site where the nervous system relaxes on top of a muscle and can initiate muscle contraction. And you can imagine that if this is destroyed, as you can see here, that it doesn't work really well. So what do you think the major consequence is of myasthenia gravis when these neuromuscular junctions are destroyed? Bad motor moves. That's very good. That's very good, because the neuromuscular junction is, generally speaking, used for muscle contraction. So you have problems with contracting your muscles. So bad motor movement, but not just voluntary, but also involuntarily. Involuntarily. So myasthenia gravis mostly affects skeletal muscle, so muscle that is voluntarily used, like over here in your leg. But it can also affect your intestines. We will talk about the intestines later. It can affect your lungs, and it can affect your heart. And patients with myasthenia gravis often die as a result of respiratory failure. And so their problem is that they cannot make these contractions. Respiratory depression, someone mentions. Correct. Respiratory depression, which means that you're breathing less. And then at the end, respiratory failure. All right. Then we have something called compliance. And compliance is really a bit of a physics principle. But we also talked about compliance in the context of blood vessels. That blood vessels can expand and contract in response to, for example, blood flow or other needs by which you need to contract your blood vessels or expand your blood vessels. And this is also true for the lungs. So we have something called compliance of the lungs, which is that, let's see, this over here is the path of inspiration. So as you can see, pressure becomes more negative and total lung volume goes up. So this is inspiration, and this is expiration. So when you breathe out again. And compliance is the amount of pressure that you need to build up in order to get the same amount of volume. So if compliance, let's see, if compliance is high, it means that you get a lot of volume for a little bit of pressure. So high compliance means that you breathe more easily. Whereas the other side of the aisle, which is when compliance goes down, and that is that the amount of volume per increase in pressure goes down, which means that you need to build up a lot of pressure in order to respire, which means that respiration is more difficult. I think that's all about pulmonary compliance. And then we have respiratory volumes. So as you can see over here, this is a normal respiration. And this small up and down is something that we call the tidal volume over here. So the tidal volume is the are the small changes in respiration during normal and resting breathing. And let's see. And so what happens when you inspire maximally? So when you inspire maximally, get your lungs completely full, that's when this happens. So this is a normal inspiration, and then we go here. This is amplitude, a huge amplitude. Let's see, and then we go down again. So we expire again, but we don't maximally expire. So we just relax and then continue. We don't force anything. And this little part over here, so from here to here, is called your inspiratory reserve volume. And these two together are called the inspiratory capacity. Okay, who has their microphone on? Hold on. Police, could you mute yourself? All right, thank you. So this is together is called inspiratory capacity. So your capacity of inspiration. Now you can also forcefully expire. So here we have a normal breath again, and I'm going to breathe out everything that I have. And let's see, the tidal volume is this one over here. So that's the fluctuations during normal resting breathing. So, and it's about 500 milliliters. 500 milliliters. That's important, because if your tidal volume is lower, that's generally speaking a sign of decreased compliance or shallow breathing of another cause. So all right, then there's let's see this part. So when we go down here, when we go from the bottom of tidal volume to the bottom of our expiration, this is called expiratory reserve volume. And if we count these two together, so tidal volume plus your expiratory reserve volume, this is called nothing. I don't think there's a name for this. No, there's no name for this. No, I didn't think it was important either. But what is important is that there's always going to be a little bit of air left in the lungs, right? Which is could you guys stop harassing each other in the chat, by the way? So this part is the residual volume, which is about 1100 milliliter, 1100 like that, 1100 milliliters, and that's the amount of air that will always be in your lungs. This is, by the way, the sum of both lungs together. So the tidal volume of one lung would in theory be 250 milliliters. All right, if he isn't able to mute himself, then I'll do it like this. All right. So let's see. Then there's the sum of the expiratory reserve volume and the residual volume, and it's called the functional residual capacity, which is if you normally breathe, and then this is the amount of air that is functionally left in the lungs. So, for example, if you would stop breathing normally and you'd stop breathing, this amount of air will be left in the lungs. That's functional residual capacity. And if you would breathe in maximally and then breathe out maximally, like, oh God, my lines are very squiggly, then this is called the vital capacity. Vital capacity is very important. And the total amount of lung content or lung volume is called total lung capacity. It's everything together. And depending on which disease you're talking about, these might change. Please don't ask me for specifics, because this was part of study material for a theme that I've already studied for. So I could look it up though, because there are different categories for this. Here's a clinical case. Oh wait, I put some information here. So asthma and COPD. So asthma, as you guys might know, asthma is an allergic disease. So what happens in asthma is that you are hypersensitive to certain allergens, And when you inhale these allergens, that results in local inflammation. And COPD is a combination of multiple diseases, among which bronchitis. And bronchitis is also an inflammation of your bronchi, so your airways, and it can be caused by a viral infection, for example, sometimes by a bacterial infection, sometimes fungal, but most frequently we see COPD in former smokers or people who live in the city. And what happens in where's my mouse? Oh, there. Okay. So what happens in patients with asthma or COPD, which is that compliance can go down because let's see, you have inflammation, and that causes tissue damage, and your body is not good at repairing things the way they should. So you get scar tissue or fibrosis. And fibrosis, this tissue isn't really compliant, so your compliance goes down. And the compliance goes down means that you need to deliver more pressure in order to get the same increases in volume. And that means that you have problems with inspiring as well as expiring. Then there's that resistance goes up because, as you can see, the airways are now pretty large, but now they're pretty small. So you see that resistance to air flowing in goes up, which also means that it's harder to breathe. And SpO2 will generally go down in these patients. So an average measured SpO2 in a patient with COPD will lie around 85 to 90. Those are rough numbers. 88 to 92 is this area. Those are fine. I'm using relatively rough numbers. All right. Then we go to gas exchange. Gas exchange is something that's like I'm doing gas exchange in dishonor by only giving it one slide, but gas exchange is still really important to show you guys. So gas exchange is the exchange of primarily oxygen and carbon dioxide with your red blood cells and the air in the alveoli. So what happens is that, all right, so air flows in through the nose, for example. It goes not that way, that's the esophagus, but it goes this way through the trachea. And that's a doctor, right? And then like this, into the lungs. Nice. That's where air goes, not in the esophagus. That's the problem. There's like a seal here. When you're breathing, then your body will make sure that it doesn't go into your esophagus. Let's see. And this is a zoom. So if we take here, for example, over here, there's a small alveolus. We're going to take it here. And this is what an alveolus looks like. So it's a sac. And what you see is that if you go to the pulmonary capillaries, you see that there's not a lot of oxygen here. There's low oxygen. And there's high CO2, which means that CO2 will flow outwards and oxygen will flow inward. All right. And that's for the exact reason that the pressure of oxygen is higher in the alveoli than in the bloodstream. And we will come to that when we talk about oxygen and carbon dioxide transport over here. So what happens and what's important to know is that diffusion of these gases occurs over something that we call the respiratory membrane, which is this entire layer. And this layer consists of several things. So you have something that you call epithelium with a basement membrane, and it's not important to know what that is. Epithelium is a type of tissue, but luckily enough, gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide can freely flow through that to some extent. Carbon dioxide goes faster. I think it was about 25 times faster. I could be I could be wrong on this one, but I think it was around 20 to 25 times faster. Now, what's important to know is that between here you have something called an interstitial space. And an interstitial space is where all fluids in your body reside. And some of it is over here. And you can imagine that if this pulmonary membrane, so this entire layer, becomes thicker, what do you guys think happens with diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide when this membrane becomes thicker? So imagine it doesn't go like this, but it's this. Harder, slower. Yes, that's true. Not necessarily slower. It will become slower, but it's not the slower that's significant, but it's harder. Well, I mean, they're technically synonyms in this case, right? So it doesn't really matter. But yeah, it becomes harder. And so that leads us actually to our case study, which is pulmonary edema. Pulmonary edema can be caused by a lot of conditions. And what happens in pulmonary edema is in this part, the interstitial fluid part, swells because there's increased. Yeah, edema is buildup of fluid, which can cause swelling or can be visibly shown as swelling. So this will heavily expand. You can imagine that if it heavily expands, that oxygen and carbon dioxide can't really diffuse anymore. So that's why that's one of the reasons why these patients have a low SpO2 or problems with, let me just, low SpO2. That's the main reason why they have a low SpO2. Another reason is that, of course, if these fluids build up around here, they start to compress your trachea. This is the esophagus, so not the esophagus, but like over here. They start to compress the trachea or other bronchioles and bronchi. And this compression results in a decreased influx of oxygen. So that's why patients with pulmonary edema have breathing problems. And so what you want to do is that you want to relieve this. There are lymphatics that pump away this fluid. So for example, if you look at anaphylactic shock, what happens is that your capillaries become very leaky. So over here you see that this capillary has no clear holes or junctions. But imagine that in anaphylactic, like anaphylaxis, that there will be huge holes here through which water flows into the interstitium. So what you want to do is you want to treat the allergic reaction so that the influx of fluid into the interstitium goes down, and then you give your lymphatic system the time to pump it all away, because that's what lymphatics are for. That's one reason, one function of the lymphatic system. And we will dive into another function of the lymphatic system, namely your immune system, during a later lecture. Then we have oxygen transport. And oxygen transport is interesting because now we're going to start talking about partial pressures again. Kind of all over the place, right? So I told you guys that, well, look, this. So over here in venous blood, so the pressure of oxygen in your veins is 40 millimeters mercury. That's not a lot, right? Because again, what's the partial pressure of oxygen in atmospheric air? Someone remember that? Atmospheric air, 20.8%. Okay, but I'm asking for a partial pressure. So what's 20.8% of 760? It's roughly equal to, what did I say? No one comes up with 160. Very good. So, and when you inspire, it goes a bit down to 150 because you're like the air gets humidified. So it goes from 160 to 150. But you can imagine this is about 1/4 of what's in the atmosphere and what you inspire. And now what happens is that as soon as this blood goes to the lungs, which I'm going to draw like this. So this is the lungs. So let's see, they go to the lungs. What happens is this over here, is that blood will reach a partial pressure of 104 millimeters mercury. But it doesn't stay at 104. What happens is that it mixes with something called pulmonary blood. And pulmonary blood is blood that, let's see, because your lungs themselves also need a supply of blood, right? So that's why we go from 40 to 104, which is normal, and then it is mixed with a bit of deoxygenated blood from the lungs. You didn't really miss that much. So again, brief recap. In venous blood, so the blood of your veins, partial pressure of oxygen is 40, which is really low. But luckily, when it goes to the lungs will fill it with oxygen, so it goes up to 104 millimeters mercury, and then it will decrease a bit to about 95. This is shunt blood. And shunt blood is blood that doesn't contain oxygen anymore because it was used to give the lungs oxygen. Because the lungs, they work to give us oxygen, but they also want a small bit of oxygen themselves. So that's when it goes down. And so it goes through the arteries, through the arteries. And in the arteries, there's no exchange of gas, but then it goes through the capillaries, and then it almost instantly hits a downhill and goes back to 40. And in these capillaries is where gas exchange occurs. And as you can see here, so if we go back to here, like this, in the arteries, partial pressure of oxygen is 95. And because the partial pressure in the interstitial fluid, so the fluid around your cells, again, the interstitial fluid is this over here, is 40. And in the cells themselves, it's even 23. So it first diffuses into the fluid and then goes into the cells. And what you then get is that the PO2 will slowly become the same as interstitial fluid, and therefore it will be 40. And that's one cycle of oxygen transport. Now, with carbon dioxide, something similar happens, but the other way around, right? So you first don't have a lot of carbon dioxide. There's a lot of carbon dioxide in your cells. Why do you guys think there's more carbon dioxide found in your cells? Anna says waste. Sarah says because it's bad. Well, if it's bad, then why is it not in the veins? Anna is on the right track. She says waste product. All right. A waste product of what is the question? From cellular respiration or metabolism. Exactly. So your cells use, for example, glucose in order to get energy, and a byproduct of that is carbon dioxide. And so there's a lot of carbon dioxide here, which diffuses into the interstitial fluid. And then from the interstitial fluid, it goes into the capillaries, and then it goes this way, and then it becomes 45. So you can see there's a relatively small difference here, whereas there's a lot of oxygen that's transported. Because you always want a lot of oxygen, but you do not need to get rid of too much carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide has multiple functions in the body, because it also helps with keeping the acid level of your blood in check. And now what you can see is that, which is perhaps normal, but to some people it's not, which is that if blood, let's see, that when blood flow increases, so when we go this way, what you see is that the PCO2, or the partial pressure of CO2, goes down. And so if there's a high CO2 level, which can be caused, for example, by exercise, then what happens is that blood flow will go up towards these organs. So if you're exercising, there's going to be a lot of CO2 in your muscles. And one reason as to why a lot of blood will flow to your muscles is so you can get rid of all this carbon dioxide, because it's very acidic and it can have negative effects for both local muscles, but also for systemic organs like your brain. Another reason, of course, the supply of oxygen and nutrients. But carbon dioxide can also be used in processes involved with the kidneys, but we will discuss the kidneys in a later lecture. Let's see, is there anything else? Yeah. So when metabolism increases, you see that oxygen tends to be, or that CO2 levels tend to be higher, but still your body will try to decrease these by means of increasing blood flow. Now this curve is really interesting. There's a shift in 30 minutes, right? Yes. I will quickly. We're going to skip these two because these are only relevant if you go to the mountains. We will skip those two. So, but this one is important because this is something called the oxygen dissociation curve. And what you can see here is that we often talk about SpO2, right? And that normal SpO2 is 95 to 100. That's the same as saying that normal PO2, if you look here, that normal PO2 should be around 90 or higher. Let's go. So here is 95. And if we go like this, whoops, it's about here, right? So it's about 90. So if you want to get a 95% saturation, you need a partial pressure of 90. And what you have to remember from this is that decreases in partial pressure of oxygen don't mean equal decreases in saturation. So if you have a partial pressure of 20, you have an oxygen saturation of around 27%. And that's not really good. What's the difference between SpO2 and PO2? This is the fraction of hemoglobin molecules, so Hb, that is fully saturated with oxygen. And every hemoglobin molecule can bind to 4 O's, to 4 O2, sorry, to 4 oxygen molecules. And PO2 is the pressure of oxygen in your blood. Pressure. There we go. So what you have to remember from this is that, for example, you could say, all right, we often say that below 93 we will start to intervene. So 93 is about here, right? So it's about 80. So when it decreases with 10 millimeters mercury, we intubate. But as you can see here, several steps later, at 20, saturation is about 27%, but at 40, it's already 70%. Or about 7. I'm not good with lines, but it's about 70%. So you get a almost 50% increase when you go from 20 to 40. And that's an important relationship to remember. And what happens, and that's my not my last comment, because we'll also go to regulation of respiration, which will be important with in respect to the kidneys as well. We're just going to leave it to the lungs this time, which is that depending on certain factors, these curves can shift to the right. And when they shift to the right, it means that they are letting oxygen go, that hemoglobin will release oxygen and adopt carbon dioxide. And this occurs in for 4 different reasons. Let's see, which means we'll get acidic, right? Blood will get less acidic because carbon dioxide will be taken from the blood and adopted by by hemoglobin molecules. So you will lose carbon dioxide in the blood, and so your blood will be less acidic. So it'll be more alkaline, so it will go more towards a normal level. So with a normal pH value of 7.4, that's this. When pH goes down, also known as increased hydrogen ions, or when there's more CO2 or a higher temperature, or more of something called BPG, which is a waste product of metabolism of your red blood cells. If these all go up, this curve will shift to the right, which means more oxygen will be released to your tissues and more carbon dioxide will get excreted so that you can get back to the normal line. And when it shifts to the left, it means that there are 2 less hydrogen ions and that there's not that much CO2 and that temperature went down and that BPG went down. So, for example, when you start exercising, all of these 4 things go up. When you start exercising, your blood will become more acidic. You'll get more CO2 in your cells. Your temperature will go up, and your metabolic waste products will go up. So, in exercise, this curve will shift to the right, and more oxygen will be released in order to compensate for that. And then finally, regulation of respiration. This is my last slide, kids. So what you have is, this is the brainstem. Brainstem. Brain. Ooh, brain. I'm not that fast. I should get faster with this. So pons. Yeah. So let's see. Over here is the pons, and I think that this constitutes the medulla. And then let's see. So this part is responsible for breathing. And what happens is that if there's a lot of CO2, where's my mouse again? Oh, there, okay. So if there's a lot of CO2, it will bind to water and form something called carbonic acid. Carbonic acid. All right. And this is carbonic acid. And why is that? Well, you have a certain region in your brainstem called the chemosensitive area. And this one is very sensitive to hydrogen ions. But the thing is that hydrogen ions cannot, or can at least poorly, cross the blood-brain barrier. And why is that? It's because when the blood gets too acidic, your nervous system will heavily respond, and your nervous system does not like that. And so what happens instead is that CO2 forms carbonic acid together with water, and carbonic acid can pass the blood-brain barrier. And then this goes in, and it dissociates into hydrogen and a bicarbonate ion, and hydrogen will stimulate this, something called the inspiratory area of the chemosensitive area, and you see these neurons, and these neurons will go to your lungs, like this. Over here, these are your lungs, and they tell the lungs, go hoo-ha, go breathe. That's what the inspiratory area is for. Because when there's a lot of CO2 in your blood, that probably might mean that you're breathing too shallow or too less. So when there's a high CO2 in your blood, we call this hypoventilation. Hypoventilation. And when there's too little CO2, which is also possible, we call this hyperventilation. So remember the difference between tachypnea and hyperventilation, and the difference between bradypnea and hypoventilation, because they are not the same. Because tachypnea, so tachy, let's see, is the same as a respiratory rate that's above 18. But that doesn't always mean the same as hyperventilation. Someone could have over here a respiratory rate of 40, a lot, but his CO2 level could be 60 millimeters mercury. And we just talked about it, that the normal CO2 should be between 40 and 42. I'm not sure whether I mentioned this, but it's kind of obvious, right, based on this picture. So 40 and a little bit more, 42. So let's see. So if this one's high and the respiratory rate high, so what do you think this patient is? Is this patient hypoventilating or hyperventilating? Is this patient hypoventilating or hyperventilating? Yeah, this patient is hypoventilating because there's too much CO2. He's tachypneic. He's breathing 40 times per minute. That's not healthy. But his CO2 level aren't healthy either. And in spite of a high respiratory rate, he is still hypoventilating. Wow, that's interesting, right? How can that be possible? How can that be possible? For example, in shallow breathing. So you breathe, but you breathe like very shallowly, for example, because you have fractures in your ribs. And so what you then get is a high respiratory rate because you're trying to compensate for breathing, and this area keeps on being stimulated, which is why your respiratory rate goes up by a lot. But your CO2 can't be compensated because your breathing is shallow. And then someone asked, on what tests can you see CO2? So CO2 is part of the BMP. So we're going to quickly discuss the BMP. let's see. I can do it over here because we're not going to do these slides anyway. This was interesting though. But the BMP constitutes of the following. BMP. I'm going to draw something like this. All right. There are 7 items on the BMP, which is why it's sometimes also called a Chem 7. And now that I'm giving a lecture to all of you, let me check at who are all in the VC. I will ask you this during the shift. So BMP consists of the following items. Sodium, which is Na plus sodium. Chloride, which is Cl minus. Potassium, which is K plus. Carbon dioxide, which we just talked about. There's BUN, which is the same as urea. There's creatinine, and that's a hormone. That's a K plus is potassium. CR stands for creatinine, and creatinine is a waste product of muscle metabolism, and it's important in diagnosing disease of your kidneys because your kidneys are supposed to excrete everything. But if your blood creatinine levels are too high, it means your kidneys aren't excreting it enough, which is a sign of liver or of kidney failure. Sorry, and glucose. And this is a BMP. CR is creatinine. CREATINE. Waste product of muscle metabolism, and your kidneys excrete it, but if your blood creatinine levels are too high, it means your kidneys aren't excreting creatinine enough, which means your kidneys are failing. It's a sign of kidney failure. BUN. That's a urea. Urea is a waste product of amino acids, and it's the main ingredient of pee. And high urea is also a sign of kidney failure, or can be a sign of overnutrition with proteins. All right. I think I'm gonna start hosting the lecture. We might discuss hyperbaric and hypobaric later, but it's only relevant for when we're in high up in mountains or we've been talking to divers. But still, it's really interesting. Let me host the shift like this. All right. Are there any questions next to what we just discussed? Did the slides finish? Yes. So this is a BMP. Can you all go over this graph again? All right, very quickly. So what we have here, let me first see if I can erase it all like this. All right. So, oh my snap, I learned some stuff though. All right. So this over here, this small thing, when we go up and down, is called a tidal volume. And that's the normal respiration. So when you lightly breathe in and breathe out, this is normal breathing in resting. So when you're sitting down reading a book, that's this. Now, then what happens? Imagine, this is called the tidal volume, by the way. So imagine we're now going to fully breathe in. So we're just normal breathing, and all of a sudden we're going like this. So, and then this, and then we go back to normal, not to our max, not to what we can fully expire, but to normal again. And then this part over here, on top of your tidal volume, is called the inspiratory reserve volume. And your inspiratory reserve volume can be increased in certain lung diseases and can be decreased in certain lung diseases. And then there's inspiratory capacity, which is the sum of tidal volume, and which is over here, So inspiratory resolve volume, IRV. IRV is tidal volume plus ERV. Plus, let's see, no, sorry, get rid of this. IC is IRV plus VT. So that's inspiration. Expiration works similarly. So imagine if we're just regularly breathing and then we're breathing everything out until we can't anymore. And then we go back up. And this part, everything below the tidal volume, is called expiratory reserve volume. So that's the maximum amount of extra volume that you can expire. And there's no name for tidal volume and expiratory reserve volume together. Then there's vital capacity, which is inspiratory resolve volume, as you can see here, which is IRV plus VT plus ERV. And then there's something called functional residual capacity, which is the when you're breathing normally and you stop breathing, so you're over here, it's the amount of air. Ooh, that went really sideways. It's the amount of air that's still inside your lungs that you can use for gas exchange. And then total lung capacity is everything together. As you can see, it's the same as vital capacity plus residual volume, or it's the same as inspiratory capacity plus functional residual capacity. Then Claude asks, what kind of treatment is there for myasthenia gravis? What we use for myasthenia gravis is that we can use, because they're auto antibodies. What we generally use to treat them is something called monoclonal antibodies, or MABs. MABs, like rituximab. That's an example. We can use those. And what we sometimes also do is that we give them stimulants. So we use this to target the autoimmunity, and what we do to help them get functional neuromuscularity again is that we can use stimulants for that. There are specific medications for myasthenia gravis on the market. Let's see. Oh, I accidentally clicked everything away. Then Southern asked about asthma and COPD. Can it be genetic? Interesting question. So for both, COPD to some extent, but COPD is mostly environmental. Asthma is to some extent genetic. And the thing about asthma is an allergic disease, right? And so what happens is that you get this disease not because you inherit the disease, but because you get it based on immune response. So there are some allergens, some dust particles that if you breathe them in, that your immune system will respond to these. And that's basically asthma. And there are some genes that are linked to being more likely to get asthma. Let's see, do you only get asthma if you have allergies? No, but it is true that if you have, for example, a food allergy as a child, that you're more likely to get hay fever, also known as allergic rhinitis, and asthma later in life, and eczema. Because if you get one very early in life, you're likely to get multiple. I personally have asthma, and I have hay fever, so allergic rhinitis, and I sometimes have eczema on my hands. I do not have any food allergies as far as I'm concerned. Let's see. So I think we're just gonna, let's see. Delete. So I know I'm joining now. Let's see.